What exactly is wrong with gaming consoles, me bod dildos that plug into an iPhone? That's just for anyone who'd switched off, but now you're listening to me talking about dildos.
Hello, hello. Welcome to Life of the Party, a deep dive into everything to do with, well, was everything to do with your party, now everything to do with the Green Party, or whatever party we end up being a part of. I'm your host, Shanice McBean, and I'm joined here today by Joe.
Hello.
And Jonas.
What's up?
So it's been a politically charged week. There's lots that's been going on. Jonas, what have you got for us for the news section?
Yeah, we wanted to begin this week with a bit of a dive into Andy Burnham's ascension to Labour Party leadership. By the time you are listening... Him again. I'm sure there'll be some of our listeners saying the same thing as well. But by the time you're listening to this, Burnham is likely to be the Prime Minister of Britain. His coronation was pretty seamless.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
By the 19th of July?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Someone's done their research for this episode, and some of us have not.
Yeah, clearly I haven't. Fuck. I did not realize it was that quick.
Well, egg on my face if it's not true. But his coronation was pretty seamless by all accounts, especially by the standards of modern politics once he'd actually won the Makerfield seat. I think that also comes with a danger, this was a coronation. You know, his rise to power leaves him with a remarkable amount of power. And just yesterday, one parliamentary insider referred to his plans and the plans of those around him as a black box, incredibly ambiguous, unknown, yet to be determined. However, it is perhaps the case that in our growing sense of what a Burnham leadership might look like, that we also see some fault lines. The favourite to be Chancellor, Ed Miliband, formerly Labour leader, ran in 2015, has by all accounts been beaten to the chancellorship by Shabana Mahmood, the outgoing Home Secretary, a person often described as a blue Labour darling, who now leaves an indelible stamp on this new administration, both for the support Burnham gave her immigration bill and for the position she has been given at the head of the economy. Now, I want to put some focus on this basically, because we've talked previously about the people who will populate Burnham's group of economic advisors, largely establishment economists who you could kind of generously characterize as people who grasp that things aren't currently working with British capitalism. And we know what a big blow Ed Miliband's rejection is to those on the centre left and the Labour left who thought that they might have the ear of Andy Burnham. But none of that, I think, is to say that Burnham and Mahmood don't at least believe that they have something distinctive to offer Britain's political economy. So there's been a lot of noise in the press that Mahmood is unfairly labelled Blue Labour. But if you actually poke beneath the surface of a political economy, it's certainly the case that on the one hand, you have a social conservative, but you also have a social conservative who thinks the state can engineer society and the market without intruding upon it too much. So reindustrializing the country stands out as a kind of key ambition there. There's big talk as well that, Shabana Mahmood isn't a pushover, right? And that, takes some significance when it comes to relationships with the Treasury. Now, I could focus in this section on the fact that it was Louise Haigh and Annalise Midgley who, organisers behind Burnham's election campaign and his ascension to office, who forcefully pushed against Ed Miliband's appointment to the chancellorship on the basis of his net zero credentials and him not being northern working class. Hayes' claim to that particular bit of heritage is obviously ludicrous when you look into her background.
I was wondering if you were going to say that. I was
always got to get the
I was
digs in,
definitely going to say this bit if you were going to say this bit. Go on.
But we move. I could have emphasised the appointment to Chief of Staff James Purnell, a friend of Burnham's, a Blairite, someone who wants to gut the welfare state as we know it. We could stress the numerous policies that Burnham has shifted on: fiscal rules, wealth taxes, welfare, you name it. The list goes on. But I think the Mahmood appointment and the generous reading of her economic ambitions is interesting and telling, because I think the idea that plucky little Britain, a provincial country off the coast of France, with a much reduced state capacity compared to, say, the 70s, when it did have manufacturing industry at scale, is going to reindustrialize and become a manufacturing powerhouse shorn from any energy transition, something that Andy Burnham and the people around him avoid the question of, very, very importantly. Completely unalert to the reality of East Asia, namely Chinese high-tech manufacturing dominance.
Yep,
In a global
exactly.
economy characterized by manufacturing overcapacity is for the birds, basically. And I think it just, for me, shows how out of depth our political classes, particularly these people, that in the face of British stagflation, it evidences to me how easily Burnham, Mahmoud, who is said to be tough, and the dubious characters around him could be jumped into go down into the Treasury, bond vigilantes, and the OBR. Does this mean Burnham will be a continuity Starmer leader? Not quite. I think his operation will be better, more organized, his communication more compelling. And, he's a politician. He's not a lawyer. He's not a state apparatchik. That will serve him well in comparison to Starmer. And I think, definitely a case that he will kind of deliver on some things, right? Like, I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility, for example, that he'll deliver on forms of regulation over water companies, for instance. But I guess one thing to bear in mind here is that Burnham has the public's ear right now, and that's a rare thing in contemporary politics. And so we should expect that he's saying a lot of things we want to hear and that he'll deliver on some things. But I'm afraid beyond that, I don't have much hope. I guess like the project here is to rescue the Labour Party and by extension, the British state at large from the kind of jaws of populist threats left and right. And, maybe we can say, well, the left is weak. We need a strong left of centre to defeat the radical right or the possibility of a Tory reform coalition. But then we have to ask ourselves a series of questions sincerely beyond the affect and vibes of Andy Burnham about whether he'll stop that generational march to the far right, stop our neighbours having their houses burnt down, or whether he'll simply delay the rightwards polarisation we will face, whilst also kind of accentuating it by adopting the framework of Blue Labour. And I guess I'll end on this with this section. There's a question here for Zach Polanski and the Greens, particularly the left and the Greens, which is to say, are you going to occupy a kind of eco-populist ground in both senses of that frame, the eco and the populist? Because there's weaknesses for Burnham on both senses of that frame that you should be pressing. Are you going to do that as fully as possible? Are you going to refuse to be harangued by the confusions and the timidity which comes with parts of the Green Party who are more liberal, more happy to subordinate the project to a notion of the Progressive Alliance? Because I think there's real space for that, for a left project in this terrain with the moves that Burnham is currently making,
Yeah,
with the
100%.
disappointment that he's currently setting in. I thought the messaging from Polanski yesterday that Burnham is subservient to the City of London was good. But I think also it does require detailing what you actually want to do. What is your actual agenda in a way that Polanski and the Greens haven't done yet, in a way that concretely tackles people's shit living standards, the climate crisis, and the lack of sovereignty in people's lives.
For me, what is striking about the Mahmoud potential appointment, and obviously he's not prime minister yet, but all the indications are she's going to be a significant figure in his government, is Mahmoud's journey as a politician. I think back to those videos of her from when she was on Gaza solidarity demonstrations and how the kind of left of Labour language that was part of her early political career, and how under Starmer's government and the position that she took under Starmer's government, how that just got completely abandoned in the hopes that her tough, so-called tough but just racist immigration policies would be able to appeal to a part of the country who were left behind and, who Labour needed to, through so-called smart political manoeuvring, and how she has been so willing to stand behind a prime minister who facilitated wholesale genocide, at points proudly so. We're talking about when Keir Starmer talked about the fact that, Israel has that right to shut off water and electricity and blockade Gaza, and how easily she was able to cede ground to the right. And I think that fills me with a lot of terror for what's to come under Andy Burnham, that he was willing to take that figure. And it was only just last week that he came out and said something along the lines of Labour's position on Gaza wasn't quite right, trying to appeal to that left wing, yet at the same time instituting a character like Mahmoud, who's been central to Keir Starmer's premiership, central to that McSweeney strategy of appealing to the reform segments of the country and population. That trajectory worries me with regards to the economy, because it doesn't suggest that we're dealing with a potential chancellor who's going to back the working class, back the trade unions. It suggests to me someone who is at any point willing to once again drop the left, drop ordinary working class people, and cede to pressures from her right. And I think the message that Burnham is sending is tacit but clear, which is that he is going to be a government of the capitalist class as opposed to the working and ordinary classes. And I think you're absolutely right, Jonas. The space that has now created to the left, I think we have to be clear-eyed and seize that.
Yeah, I just want to focus on the climate stuff for a minute, because I just think I cannot believe that nominally Ed Miliband's been done in because he is too strong on the climate, on net zero. Climate action is still like broadly and widely popular with all of the voters Labour needs to win. Every kind of voter that Labour needs to win, whether you have a left bloc, right bloc theory of how electoral politics splits, whether you think that more voters come over from reform and it's the softer, more socially progressive edge of the reform vote, whichever way you think, like net zero and more broadly climate action is very popular and is only going to become more so as the reality of the climate crisis becomes plain. At the same time, by, I think, essentially saying we're not going to take climate action seriously, and I think that's how we should read Ed Miliband not getting the chancellorship and Burnham being open to more drilling in the North Sea. I think you do two things. Number one, you open the perfect line of differentiation between Labour and the Greens, where the Greens can say they do not take the climate crisis seriously. We will try and combat the climate crisis and also make your life better at the same time through some Green New Deal style or Green Industrial Revolution style politics and program, which we're going to talk more about later. And also it makes, I think, it basically an impossibility for there to be a meaningful progressive alliance between those two parties in a formal way, because there is no way the Green Party at their conference will ever vote, I don't think, to be in progressive alliance with a party that's saying, yes, we want to drill more oil. That's just not going to happen. That's just not going to happen. And I think they've shot themselves in like the face and the foot and every other body part by doing this, because they had such a good opportunity, I think, to rehabilitate the Labour Party through an Ed Miliband chancellorship. And I find it absolutely wild that Lou Haig and others have basically adopted this, I can only call it kind of like northern identity politics thing, where they don't like him because he's from London, and they've got it into their heads that climate action is really unpopular. And I'm sure it's the fact that Lou Haig feels a bit bad about the fact that she went to a private school and she's not properly working class, so she's got to cosplay it. I bet people like that from where I'm from, and I'm sure that's a part of it. I just think it's mad. And I think the last thing that I'll say on this, and I think the most abject part of this story, is the fact that, it wasn't just the political media class and these crap soft left Labour politicians that don't know what they think and finance capital and fossil capital that banded together. It was also the supposedly left-led trade unions, including Sharon Graham of Unite, 100%. Who basically were completely sectional in their interest. And just because they represent workers in the fossil fuel industries, by the way, a tiny minority of Unite members, minority. It's Sharon Graham's base, which is why she gives a shit, but like tiny minority of Unite members, because they represent it. Sharon Graham, who supposedly doesn't intervene in politics and supposedly doesn't intervene in the Labour Party, comes out and says, no, I don't want Ed Miliband. What do we want instead? Someone like Shabana Mahmood. So I just think the whole thing is, from a Labour perspective, like wildly irrational, but also from on like a broader political perspective, like
it's a similar thing to
tragic.
How Andy Burnham is leveraging his individual popularity, hoping that he can surround himself with these political nutcases, but he can leverage his own individual popularity to see him through. Do you see any resemblances there to Reform and Nigel Farage? As Nigel Farage Reform stakes most of their reputation and popularity on the character of Nigel Farage. They surround themselves with really unpopular Tory figures, but hope that individual popularity can see them through. And it's not always been the best strategy for Reform, and it's not clear to me that it will be the best strategy for Andy Burnham, particularly as he's in the kind of slipstream of Keir Starmer's deeply, deeply unpopular party.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're hanging a lot on Burnham's eyelashes and Mancunian
Yeah.
populism, which is going to get really thin and boring very soon. I just, you know what I mean? Like, it's not durable and it's not going to last if there's not substance behind it. All of that said, I think he's different to Farage insofar as he's just a lot more collegiate and he's like bringing people in, and he's not kind of a dictatorial authoritarian figure at the top of his party in the way that Farage is at the top of Reform, and in the way that Farage managed to create Restore by blowing up the relationship with Rupert Lowe and Rupert Lowe leaving. So I don't think it's the same in that regard. I think, to loop back to Jonas's thing, I think it's really important for us to have a very strong, like, analytical grasp of what we actually think is going to happen. And obviously we're still speculating because we don't know who's going to get him. But I think it is important to recognise that, Mahmoud may well be up for doing a bunch of stuff, such as nationalising various industries. You know what I mean? There was an interview with there's an interview with Maurice Glassman last year, who's been a big backer of hers, and he was like, yeah, of course you back nationalisation of water, of course you back nationalisation of steel, of course you back nationalisation of the railway. So I think we can't, we shouldn't say, oh, it's just going to be Starmer again, because that's just an easy.
It's a bit of a political salve.
It's a bit of a lazy way of understanding it, I think.
Next few years, and aren't really attuned to the fact that actually it might be the case that Andy Burnham is a formidable opponent to the left in ways that we haven't experienced before.
I think so, insofar as he will do some immediate cost of living stuff, and I think he will do some stuff around public control and nationalisation. I think that will happen. I don't think it's going to be anywhere near as extensive as what Matt Lawrence and Commonwealth want and what mainstream the Compass Line group want. But I think there's going to be some of that. I think the problem with them, though, is that they're just opening an obvious front with the Greens, which I think if you look at the electoral geography of the Green seats, we're trying to win 30, 40, 50, 60, mostly urban seats. And you look at the makeup of those seats, there's a lot of people that care about the climate crisis. There's a lot of people that care about your position on immigration. There's a lot of people that care about your position on these various social issues. There's a lot of people that will care about how you treat welfare claimants. And I can see some like what we might have thought of as before as unlikely alliances forming. It's no coincidence that Zach Polanski's best day of media coverage in The Guardian for a very long while was yesterday. And I think the reason that happened is because some of the climate liberals at The Guardian will be, and sorry for anyone from The Guardian listening, I don't think everyone's a climate liberal at The Guardian, but like some of the climate liberals at The Guardian, they'll be looking at Burnham, they'll be like, what the fuck? Like, why is he dropping net zero? Why does he want to drill more? I'm thinking like people like Peter Walker, right? Who, not left wing, like a guy in the lobby, but he'll be looking at that, he'll be like, what the fuck? And they'll be seeing Polanski in the Greens as almost like quite a safe pressure group to back, because it, only on track to win 30, 40, 50, 60 seats, can be a pressure to Labour's left to push them further on climate. And I think tacit alliances like that could actually be really quite powerful, especially when you consider the electoral geography.
I agree with that. I mean, it's worth saying as well that, like, one of the key, and, whether you frame this as a fight is contingent on what the Parliamentary Labour Party decide to do, right? But one of the key battlegrounds is going to be the kind of 5 billion black hole that Starmer has left Burnham with the Defence Investment Plan, and how Burnham decides to deal with that. I mean, all of the noise so far seems to be that he's going to deal with that by cutting welfare, particularly PIP payments. And, there's a long sequence of orchestrated noise at the minute coming from sections of the Parliamentary Labour Party to ensure that does happen, right? Healey's resignation, more than anything, was a big testament to that. I mean, there's talk that
well, Healey's been floated for foreign sectors.
Okay.
It's like fucking hell, man. You know what I mean?
And there's a lot of talk about the Defence Investment Plan delivering 60,000 jobs, particularly in the Northwest. Obviously, what's not said is that if the comparable amount of cuts are made in welfare to make that happen, there'll be tens of thousands of cuts to DWP jobs and civil service jobs. So, these are the kind of trade-offs that are being made. I guess I wanted to say two things off the back of that, which is, one, it does seem quite clear to me now, in a way that it didn't seem clear to me previously, that Sharon Graham's anti-politics, if you want, has meant right-wing politics on two of the key questions of our age, which is the climate question and the question of war. That doesn't mean
100%.
within the union that she hasn't been, pushed into better positions by trade union militants and rank and file militants. Those are things that have happened when you look at some of the battles that have happened within Unite, but it is something worth registering and taking seriously. And, I say this with no, because the Unite leadership election is heating up. I say this with no consolation, right? Because on the other hand, it's like not prioritizing or putting much emphasis into worker organizing and rank and file organizing and treating the Labour Party as the key site of struggle as the alternative, right? So like there's no good story in Unite at the minute, and I'd love militants in Unite to correct me on that. And then there's another thing here which it's worth bearing in mind, which is that Burnham hasn't talked about nationalisation, which is to say that I could see some forms of nationalisation happening because, capitalist.
Yeah, I mean Starmer just nationalised British
and capitalist
Steel.
governments nationalise stuff all the time, right? I mean, there's a problem in the history of the left of thinking about nationalisation as a socialist panacea, right? That state nationalisation happens repeatedly all the time, but it's worth just being clear that Burnham's language is very much a regulatory language rather than
Joe, you used a phrase that I really liked, which is opening up fronts for the Green Party. And it occurred to me that with the North Sea drilling, Trump made an intervention really early on about Andy Burnham, saying that, there's this potential new prime minister on his way in the UK. He's really liberal. He doesn't want to drill in the North Sea. I don't think I'm going to like him very much. And it's really interesting how that question of kind of the climate is also a question of imperialism and connection to the US and connection to US interests as well, and how the Greens can differentiate themselves from Burnham on the question of Trump now as well. Because Trump's whole thing is drill, baby, drill, right? Like that you can or that the UK can see its economy boom and see its energy prices go down if it decides to drill. And then, of course, there will be ways in which America have vested interests in that. And it just seems very short-sighted for Burnham to create that tacit connection between him and Trump. And then, Jonas, on your point, there's that famous Desmond Tutu quote, isn't there? If you're on the side, or if you're neutral in situations of injustice, then you've chosen the side of the oppressor. And that's just Sharon Graham from head to toe.
It's also worth saying that on Burnham and his popularity and his ability to win back voters that have gone to the Greens, yes, he hasn't actually been, crowned as Labour leader and PM yet, but we haven't seen a massive collapse in the Green vote concurrent with a rise in Labour since Burnham won Makerfield and has been mooted as the leader of the Labour Party. And this is considering the fact that Green voters are higher information voters that, spend more time thinking about and listening to politics. I just think that is quite surprising. There has been, a general downward trend since the peak of the Green vote about 6 or 8 months ago, but it's not concurrent with Burnham. It's not. And that for me is interesting. Like I do suspect actually that the 10, 11, 12% of what I would call now the core Green vote, there's a certain resilience there. And actually, they're not going to be that easy to win back. I think they might be easy to win back in a tactical way in certain seats if the danger is that reform will win them. I think in that like limited sense, they might be easy to win back. But I think in a broader way, I think people are deeply distrustful of the Labour Party. In part for some people because what they did to Jeremy Corbyn. In part for some people because of what they've done in Gaza. And I don't know. I just don't see him winning a lot of them back if this is his direction that he goes in.
Thanks for that conversation, lads. Lots in there, and I'm sure many more updates and upsets over the coming weeks as the political situation unfolds and Burnham is coronated. But part of that conversation touched on the climate. And Joe, I know you've got some thoughts and some provocations and some questions on climate politics to bring to the podcast today. Hit us.
Okay, so this week's hot take. Is it a hot take? Maybe it's a hot take. I'm not sure. I've been thinking about the climate crisis a lot over the last couple of weeks. In part, that's because it's really hot and, I haven't been able to sleep and none of the rest of us has been able to sleep. But, I've been thinking about it a lot over the last couple of weeks and reading a lot, and I've also been thinking about a lot because, I'm part of an eco-socialist project in the Green Party, and if you're going to be part of an eco-socialist project, you're going to take the idea of eco-socialism seriously. And I've been reading this book, waving it like John McDonnell waved the little red book at the dispatch box.
What's the book called? Yeah,
it's called All In. It's called All In: A Revolutionary Theory to Stop the Climate Collapse, and it's by two Portuguese climate activists called Mariana Rodrigues and Sinan Eden. And it's really brilliant. I think I talked about it on the podcast before. It's a really brilliant, direct, strategic book, which, essentially makes the argument that, we're obviously in a moment of climate collapse, in a moment of extreme climate collapse. And, for them, there is no anti-capitalist movement at the moment with a plan of action compatible with climate deadlines. So there's no anti-capitalist movement with a plan of action compatible with climate deadlines. And what they mean by this is that they look at projects like mine, an eco-socialist Green Party, or another democratic socialist project, say like, Bernie or Zoran or Jeremy Corbyn. And they say, okay, these projects have a plan for dismantling capitalism. It's, you win power in the state and you also build popular power. And then you put in transitionary measures to democratize the economy and protect working class communities. And through popular mobilization, you move through a mixed economy. And then eventually you transition into some form of economy, which is like more socialist or overwhelmingly socialist, because you shrink and constrict the market over time. And they say, yeah, that's completely reasonable, but you're all insane because the climate crisis is happening and you just don't have time to do that. And the urgency of the situation means that you can't be talking about 20, 30, 40-year transitions to socialism, or even 5, 10, 15-year transitions to socialism, because it's just too long. But then they look at the revolutionaries and those who believe in a theory of rupture, where instead of slowly dismantling the state by taking power in it, instead you attack it from the outside and you smash it in that classic revolutionary sense. And they say, okay, the revolutionaries, at least in theory, have a shorter timeline because, the rupture could happen at any moment. The revolution is just around the corner, comrades. But the problem is there's no actual plan for how to make that revolution happen, So it's like they're on the right timeline, but there's no plan. The democratic socialists, they've got a plan, but they're on completely the wrong timeline. And the book basically has this gambit where it says, okay, what does it mean to come up with a plan for the revolution? And they explicitly try to set a deadline for this. They're like, okay, we want to come up with a plan that achieves global revolution by 2030, or at least achieves revolution in the capitalist core by 2030. So there can be a decarbonization process from 2030 to 2050. So there are no more emissions at 2050, which is roughly what is needed in their working to cap the limits of the climate crisis at 1.5 to 2 degrees and not have all of the incredibly terrifying runaway effects that would happen if it goes above that. Now, look, I have my problems. I have my problems with this. It's not going to be the core of the hot take, but I have my problems with this. I don't think they reckon with the incredible, monopoly that states and elites have on, like power and technology and violence and governance. Like we are able to be controlled in so many ways that we weren't 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 or 100 years ago. We exist in this, what Andreas Malm calls in Black Skin, White Masks, like a revolutionary moment without a revolutionary subject. Like, when revolutions were on the cards in the early 20th century, there was the industrial proletariat as the obvious revolutionary subject.
At least not in the West.
Have that subject now. And that's at least not in the West. And that's a massive problem. And I think also just, we can theorize about this stuff, but you can also just look at where movements are at. And I just think that ruptural or revolutionary movements, at least in the West, are at a historic low ebb. Like if you, compare British anarchism to British democratic socialism, like, British democratic socialism keeps failing through the 2000s and the 2010s, like Corbynism failed. Now we're doing the Green Party and Zach Polanski again. Plenty of room for British anarchism to have an incredible resurgence. And yet there is no real British anarchist movement, as much as I have lots of British anarchist friends. So this leaves me to reflect. This leaves me to reflect on, I think, the core problem for me, because I'm not I'm not convinced by the notion that we all need to throw all in with revolutionary strategies to try to hit a global revolution by 2030. But it does leave me with this question of like, what does it mean for me to be part of a long-term transitional eco-socialist project in the context of accelerating and runaway climate change? What does it mean to be part of a project on such a timeline that just doesn't match up to the, accelerating and runaway crisis that we face? And I think it's worth underlining that crisis. I'm not going to spend 20 minutes talking to you about how bad the climate crisis is, but by 2070, MIT researchers say that the new norm for many billions of people will be impossibly high temperatures that will kill less fit people and make outdoors work impossible. 500 million will experience temperatures that will kill even healthy people in the shade within 6 hours. The IPCC's fourth report suggested that 20-30% of animal and plant species may go extinct if we go above 1.5 degrees, which we are certainly going to go above. And it's not just this fact that bad things are going to happen. It's the fact that the climate crisis, unlike other struggles, has this non-linear tipping point runaway nature to it, where you hit these certain climatic tipping points and the whole crisis gets magnified, it accelerates, and you reach points of no return. So it's just, it's very different to other struggles in that regard. And, I think I kind of think the only way to reckon with being part of a long-term transitional eco-socialist project, but also understanding that runaway climate change is here and it's happening in this intense way, is to admit something to ourselves. And I think we have to have the admission and make the admission explicit. I think it's implicit in a lot of our politics now, but I think we have to make the admission explicit that we have failed to stop climate change, and climate change isn't going to stop. The Green New Deal era, the Green Industrial Revolution of Corbyn's Labour, or the Green New Deal of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, was always wrapped up in this language of we can fix the cost of living crisis and stop the climate crisis at the same time. It was a very good political move to marry those two things. Fantastic political move, still incredibly relevant. But I think we now have to be real about the fact that we're not really talking about stopping the climate crisis in any meaningful and serious sense. We're talking about limiting some of the worst effects of the climate crisis through mitigation, through adaptation, through management, and through the reduction of emissions so we don't hit 5, 6, 7, 8 degrees, some of the most catastrophic scenarios. And I think this admission is important, because I think there's some important, almost like psychological and emotional consequences of this admission. I think we're in a very hard place as activists or organizers, in that we don't have what I'd call the reassuring Marxist teleology of the early 20th century. We don't have historical materialism. We don't have the sense that history is on our side and history is arcing towards a certain point, which will be, proletarian revolution and then socialism. We don't have that, Instead, we have the opposite sense, that actually history is arcing away from us, and it's arcing towards something that's incredibly difficult, and a context in which our lives are going to get worse, and which actually may not be wildly suited to socialism or positive social change in the way that we want. I think it's important to reckon with how hard that is for us, actually. I think it's a thing that the authors of this book miss. I think the authors of this book kind of put a lot of weight on CADA organizers, activists, and basically say, look, we need to take ourselves more seriously. We need to take the situation more seriously. We need to do global revolution in 4 years. I think what I'm saying is that we're all trying really hard, and actually the context that we're operating in is just a wildly difficult one to operate in. I think another psychological and emotional consequence of this admission is that I think it's important for us to work out how to reckon with the climate collapse and talk about it in a way that has a certain realism about it, while still being able to conduct a mass politics. And this is where I bring Extinction Rebellion in. Extinction Rebellion were fantastically adept at raising the salience of the climate crisis when they were at their height. And they built a cadre of activists through basically giving this really intense presentation where people learned how bad it is going to be. And they emphasized the doomerism and the disasterism and stuff. And it radicalized people in a way that made them completely reorient their lives towards climate activism. But I think it also radicalized people in a way where they struggled to relate to broader society and relate to a broader mass of people who weren't thinking about the climate crisis all the time, weren't intensely obsessed by it, and weren't in that doomerist space. And I think that, I don't know, I think this admission helps us at least get to a point where we can both reckon with what's going to happen, but also still talk in a register and also still relate to people that aren't, like diehard climate activists. And I think that the tenor of our politics, which follows from this, I think the tenor of our politics needs to have a certain realism to it that the Green New Deal never had. I think one of the problems with the Green New Deal and Green New Deal politics, and a lot of party electoral politics, is just that it can become quite boosterish. It's like one more push, one more heave. We can solve this thing if only we all vote this way. There's always this kind of false hope. I think there's a phrase for it, like cruel optimism. This idea that you like push people into this like hopeful, optimistic place, which just doesn't accord with either people's lives or the reality of the world going on around them.
Yeah.
And I do wonder if we obviously can't say vote for us because everything's going to continue getting worse. But I think there is something about being real with people that maybe Starmer tried in a way when he got in, but did it in a terrible way. But there's something about being real with people about the very kind of like the limits that we face and the realities of our position that Green New Deal politics never quite articulated. And I think, I think there's also, aside from the emotional and psychological, I think there's also just some strategic implications from this admission that we're not going to stop the climate crisis. And actually, like, the climate crisis is going to happen, and it's going to happen to us, and we're going to be subject to, its limits. And I think, one of the strategic implications is to, reconsider what socialism means in the context of scarcity. I think James Meadway's really good at this already. Like, he often says we can't just do the Corbynite program now because borrowing costs are way higher, and that was like a unique moment in history in which that program would have been viable. Now it's not, and we have to do something else. There's this general sense that everything is just going to become more zero sum, and there's just going to be more trade-offs because we're not going to have supply chains that can just like produce and deliver goods to us in the way that they always did. And I think we need to reckon with this sense of like limits and what we're going to do within those limits. And there's different ways you can go with this. There are some people that really reject this. There's a certain eco-modernist stream who, basically say that no, technology and productive technology will still save us and we can still have it all. I think the most radical expression of that, the most extreme expression of that was Ampersounds' fully automated luxury communism. And then on the other hand, there's the kind of like the doomerist eco austerity people who are basically like, we're going back to some kind of primitivist position, and we need to be talking about that in very real terms. I don't really fall into either camp, and I think there'll be a certain unevenness. I think in some ways our capacities as human beings will continue to extend, and I think the sophistication of digital worlds and AI and information technology may well increase at the same time as potentially a collapse in biodiversity and food becoming more limited and more scarce. So I think we'll have this, like an even sense of limitation, which I think we really need to reckon with for our socialism and socialist horizon. And I think we also just need to, I think another strategic implication of this is that we need to figure out new ways to combat the right and the centre when it comes to climate, because I think there might be an emerging consensus between the centre and the right, which roughly runs that, well, we've lost on the climate crisis. We're not going to be able to fix it. So what's wrong with burning a bit more oil if it makes our lives better? And I think you can totally see the North Sea drilling stuff in that context, So, a lot of people could be like, well, okay, you guys said we were going to fix the climate crisis if only we won in 2019 or whatever. You didn't win. Now we can't fix the climate crisis. Things are going to shit. So why not just burn a bit more oil? And I feel like I even see a softening of positions of some people I know on that, because there's this tacit acceptance that, like maybe the climate crisis is fucked. And I don't think that means that we fall back on the boosterism of, no, we can still fix the climate crisis, when we don't really think that's true. But at the same time, we need some ability to fight this climate nihilism, which just reinforces the right and the centre in these really negative ways. And I suppose to finish, I think, counterintuitively, I think the program really is already there, and it is. Daniel Gabor calls it the Big Green State. Obviously, we called it the Green New Deal. Like I think the politics of the Green New Deal and the Big Green State is correct. Like, I think we need massive wartime levels or pandemic levels of rapid state intervention to massively decarbonize the economy and protect working class communities. I think that is what's needed, but I think it needs to come with a politics of realism rather than boosterism. I think it needs to come with the recognition that, like, the climate crisis is happening, and there's no one magic trick for solving it.
Lots of stuff there.
Yeah, that's where I've been at.
Questions, lots of stuff. Thanks, Joe.
Small minor.
I mean,
questions.
I never thought we would be talking about historical materialism this episode. I can't lie.
Mate, I never thought it'd be me bringing up historical materialism. I mean, that's the most surprising
I think
bit.
The summary that you gave of the book was really helpful. And there's one contention in the book that I really struggle with and have a problem with: the idea that revolutionaries should be planning a revolution. For me, that seems to really misunderstand what a revolution is. Historical materialism is notoriously hard to pin down. We were talking about this the other day, Jonas. Everyone's got their own definition, and everyone uses it as almost like a cultural phrase as opposed to like a defined specific political terminology.
Or a cultish phrase.
Cultish, yes, exactly, rather than cultural, yeah. Absolutely. But I can tell you what historical materialism isn't, and it doesn't necessarily tell us what direction history goes in. It certainly doesn't propose that any particular historical direction is inevitable, but it does tell us how history moves, right? How conditions, how ideology, how material constraints, how material opportunities come together to drive history. But the missing ingredient to insurgency, whether that insurgency is riots or whether that insurgency is revolution, is the unpredictable spark, is the completely accidental or historically contingent thing that happens that you can't predict, that moves people to action. And the question of what direction insurgency goes in, whether it goes in the direction of, for example, the 2024 riots, where you get a spark, the horrific murders of those poor girls in Southport, and that creates a spark that ignites the country, or compared to 2011, the horrific murder of Mark Duggan, and that unites a spark across multi-ethnic working class England. What direction insurgency goes in is at least in part determined by what revolutionaries are doing beforehand, not necessarily planning. I don't think we can plan to have a revolution by 2030, but the work that we're doing to prepare the ground, to change hearts and minds is really important. This, I think, sounds really counterintuitive and doesn't at all meet the urgency of the climate crisis. I think part of our work is to convince people to hope and dream that, and convince people that another world, that freedom, that a good life is possible, even as our cities, light up to 40 degrees, and even as food prices soar, and even as hundreds of species go extinct. I think rather than thinking we can plan a revolution to solve the climate crisis, actually, I think the work of revolution is convincing people that actually from the very beginning, another world is possible. It is possible to change the world. I think that's a bit of a cop-out because it doesn't at all meet the urgency of the situation. But I'm not sure that history actually allows us to be more deterministic than that. Flipping the switch now and kind of thinking more about establishment politics, I do think the Greens under Zach Polanski are just not hot enough on the climate crisis. And I've said this before in relation to the fact that it's not clear to me how Zach is holding his internal base together, in the sense of there are a lot of people, part of the older segments of the party, who are in the Green Party because climate is their jam, climate is their thing. And it's not clear to me that Zach Polanski's kind of messaging on the climate is doing enough to hold his kind of side of the party and that older side of the party together. But just more generally, I think there are, as you pointed out earlier in the news section, Joe, real opportunities for a radical, socialist, revolutionary climate politics. At the moment, a vacated position.
Really, I think the point about revolutions is really important, that both of you have kind of, if we could just will a revolution and plan it into being, then we would have had it, surely. I don't want to be facetious about that point, but I do think revolutions are highly contingent events, right, and processes, and you can't plan them. You might be able to prepare and plan for their eventuality, but revolutions almost always take people by surprise, and they almost always take the revolutionaries by surprise. I think it was Lenin in the beginning of 1917. He said he didn't think he'd live to see the revolution. So it is always just worth bearing those things in mind. One thing that's really clear, right, from the conversation, from your opening remarks, Joe, is that the teleology of the 20th century was always a disaster, right? You mentioned Maurice Glasman earlier, and the last thing I want to do is get into the habit of quoting bloody Maurice Glasman in this podcast.
This is the second time he'll be mentioned today.
Yeah, I know.
Fucking nightmare.
Well, he said two things in his entire life that I have ever agreed with, and those two things are, the first is that Miles Davis's Kind of Blue is one of the best pieces of music ever conceived. But the second is that when you go to the doctor and they tell you the cancer is progressive, that's a disaster, right? And there's this thing here, right? This little word progress, which I think has always been a bit of a mess for the left, right? The German philosopher Walter Benjamin, as well as countless of other Marxist philosophers, and Marxists in particular, warned against this notion of progress and its kind of slippages and its illusions in the early 20th century, as fascism was ripping through the constituencies which made the revolutionary project possible. And, we're seeing this tearing apart again. And for Benjamin, the task is to kind of pull the emergency brake on the train headed for disaster, right? And so you have this kind of two-fold question for us, right? Which is that how do we pull the brake on the train as much as possible? How do we slow that train down? But also, how do you make the train habitable and safe for our people, right? And I think there's another point here to make when we're thinking about these kind of legacies and traditions that's worth grappling with, which is that the kind of socialist project, even in Marx's writings, wasn't always or exclusively a Promethean project, right? So it had those kind of trends and tendencies which identified industrialized growth and expansion with futurity and progress, and definitely those came to predominate what socialism looked like and felt like across the kind of statist projects of the 20th century. But it had others too, right, which was sensitive to the devastating effects of, Marx called it the metabolic rift, right, the natural disruption, the spatial unravelings, and the kind of temporal breakages between natural cycles and capitalist time that we're seeing the kind of calamitous consequences of today. And I think, each generation of socialists in that context has to think meaningfully about building a free society. But you have to ask yourselves, what are the conditions of possibility that exist to get free? And who are the kind of agents that exist to carry that out? You kind of alluded quite eloquently to this, Joe. Who could bear the agency of struggle for an eco-socialist society? Who are those class fractions, if you like, who can do that? And on what terms in this burning world? And then I think really importantly, what are the constraints on the possibilities for freedom in our current world, right? Elissa Battistoni in her latest book, Free Gifts, probes these questions, asks how we might complicate Marx's idea of the free gifts of nature, and ends up drawing a lot on Simone de Beauvoir to outline a kind of notion of freedom that's situated, ambiguous, and embodied, and particularly in the kind of constraints that capitalism's exploitation of nature has imposed upon the prospects for socialist abundance. and it, which poses a question, right? One, the very notion of abundance needs to be rearticulated and renovated, right? Abundance in what? Commodities, shit food, private luxury,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
abundance is a way of redefining what the good life is around control over time, space habitable for human beings, our lives and relations with each other beyond the commodity form. And then you have to ask the question, is that bit possible in the climate crisis? Right? Like
Yeah.
they're the real
Yeah.
questions, right? And
Yeah.
to make this a bit more concrete, like there was a poll that came out by Public First. It was run by Politico, which kind of said that a chunk of voters are much more worried about climate change than impatient for help from the government after temperatures have topped 37 degrees in parts of the country last month. So more than 40% of Brits said the recent conditions had raised their worries about climate change, while just under half said the hot weather hadn't changed their views on climate. 36% said the heat had made them more supportive of government efforts to build more clean energy projects like wind and solar, while a significant majority, 66%, were resigned to the fact that the hotter conditions during the summer months will become the new norm, right? So we see that zero sum thing there. We see that people are moved by the climate crisis, but we also see this overwhelming reality that people feel quite pessimistic about political possibilities, right? And changing things, right? And that's baked in with a whole conversation that's been developing over the past 20 years about to what extent the climate crisis is natural rather than something that is human made. And to get a little bit even more concrete, I have a close friend, one of my favorite people in the world, who works for the NHS. And we've been talking about their experience at work over the last few months during these two heat waves now, and it's awful. It's awful. Like you're in these big sweltering glass boxes, hospitals. You've got no aircon. You've got operating theatres shut down. You've got surgeries delayed by days, which bring their own consequences, both on waiting lists, but also on patients. Like if you're waiting to have jaw surgery, for example, and that's delayed by 4 days, that can cause all sorts of problems for you, right? In terms of your jaw function. Like so you have the fact that more people are going to the hospital because of these increased heat emergencies. If you work nights, you might think from the outside, oh, great, that means you don't have to work in the heat. But you'd be wrong, because you have to then try and recover and sleep during the day, during these temperature heights. So you have these whole systems breaking down within institutions, central institutions to the reproduction of the human race, that aren't fit to survive these temperatures. And it's the people who make them work and the people that need them which suffer greatly. So really important that someone like Hannah Spencer over the last few weeks has raised this question of maximum working temperatures, right? Really important. There's a book that came out recently, Workers of the World, by a guy called Lorenzo Feltrin, which is all about class struggle in the climate era, basically. They've done a great job at reviving older workerist notion from the Porto Marghera workers called against noxiousness. And I think this is really important for our moment, right? That is, in workplaces, on our estates, how do we resist the pollution of our bodies, the overwhelming of our bodies and the natural environment by capital? And for those people, it was tied to a struggle for less work and more money. But, how does the union movement, and you see instances of this begin to kind of also kind of have a flank in relationship to Hannah Spencer's idea of maximum working temperatures, but it is struggle based, right? And seeks openings and opportunities in moments like these heat waves, where you tie that struggle for maximum working temperatures to the struggle for reorganizing how we labor and how we live, and beginning to really, really think and talk about that. I mean, like, there's a macro picture as well, right? In terms of what you say. I mean, I always kind of liked the Gilets jaunes framing, the end of the month, end of the world, same perpetrator, same fight, or more ice sheets, fewer bankers. It's a kind of nice populist terrain to think on. And those are slogans which had a real resonance during that social movement. But, slogans will only get you so far in this story.
Yeah, and I want to come back to your phrase, like systems that are central to the reproduction of the human race, because I think it's really good when thinking about, socialism or communism within climate limits or within material resource constraints, to think about systems that are central to the reproduction of the human race and systems which are central to the degrading of the human race. And these, and there's some real opportunities there. Like you think about and we're coming back to this idea of like inevitable progress, right? But you think about mass communication technologies, you think about kind of like rampant Temu consumerism, and it's just quite clear to me that these things have huge negative effects, and we are probably unhappier, less fulfilled, spiritually degraded by the fact that we have phones in our pockets, we have smartphones in our pockets all of the time, and we consume all of this shit and then just throw it away. And this is where I really disagree with the eco-modernists. Like, there's one quote in a Salvage article that they were taking the piss out of, and I'm now going to take the piss out of it too, which runs, what exactly is wrong with gaming consoles, me bod dildos that plug into an iPhone? That's just for anyone who'd switched off, and now you're listening to me talking about dildos. Or Hello Kitty 40th anniversary plastic toys and Happy Meals anyways, asks this person. And my answer to that would be, there's obviously so much wrong with these things. Do you live in a different world to me? Do you live in a different world to me? Like, just obviously there's so much wrong with these things. And I think the problem is that, you know, whilst there is this abundant capacity to produce crap and sell it to us for cheap, it's quite hard to get away from these things. One of the good things, in a certain sense, about the limits that the climate crisis may impose on us is that all of that stuff may not be possible anymore. And maybe that would be a good thing. Or a step back from that is that as a society, assuming we can have some kind of like, you know, state-led plan for how we actually live, there will have to be trade-offs, and we'll have to think, okay, do we want Hello Kitty 40th anniversary plastic toys and Happy Meals, or do we want healthcare?
Yeah.
You know, do we want 4 gaming consoles? You can have 1 Xbox, that's okay. But like, do we want 4 gaming consoles? Or do you want enough time to spend with your family and friends? Or do you want public space to be in with it? You know what I mean? We'll have to make these choices, and maybe there'll be good choices to make. I think that the other thing I want to say is to come back, because we both talked in different ways about the Marxist teleology thing and this notion of inevitable progress that follows from it. And yeah, you were really right to quote Benjamin Jonas for sure. But I think I totally agree with you guys that it was a disaster in that sense. But I do kind of want to put the question to you that I do just think it's, maybe this is me strawmanning, and it's always been hard to be a revolutionary, so just tell me if I'm doing that. But I do just feel like there is something particularly difficult about trying to be on the left and trying to be a socialist or a communist in a context where it just feels like history is arcing away from you, and in a context where it's not clear who the revolutionary subject is. And, you know, like maybe I have rose-tinted glasses on, but I look back to the early 20th century revolutionaries, and I think this is why so much of the Marxist left is, you know, fixated on them to a certain extent. And I'm, you know, there's part of me that's jealous, because I think that, like, well, at least they had this kind of, I can't put it better than the sense that history was on their side, you know, even if it was naive and incorrect and whatever. Like, at least they had that sense that on a personal, emotional, psychological level was probably quite important for avoiding the sense of freeze that I just see a lot of people stuck in. You know, people are frozen watching the genocide in Gaza but feeling unable to do anything about it. They're frozen between this idea that, you know, we need a revolution to stop the climate crisis, but it feels completely impossible to do a revolution. It's just this sense of kind of like passivity and freeze. And I don't know, for me it feels really linked to that. But maybe you just guys disagree.
There's a theme that has come up a couple of times in what you've said, Jonas and Joe, around abundance, and implicitly you've kind of hinted at the fact that actually we'll need to make choices, and in the West our living standards might need to adjust or shift, or not our living standards but what we're used to living with might need to adjust or shift in the event that we were able to solve the climate crisis. And I think that, you know, one of the beautiful things about revolution is your moral fiber, your moral fabric changes. What you value, what's important to you, what you consider the good life to be, changes as the revolution progresses. You know, one of my favorite examples is how race disintegrated during the Haitian Revolution, how this notion that there were black people and white people and mulattoes, the revolutionary subjects, started to abandon and discard that idea as the revolution progressed. And, you know, the old moral fabric disintegrated and a new one was woven. And I think we have to, as revolutionaries, going back to that question of, you know, the Marxist teleology, and how do we achieve our version of progress, even when history seems so against us. Part of that, I think, is telling stories about what abundance means. Fundamentally, if we were to solve the climate crisis, the West would need to adjust its levels of consumption, its approach to what it considered a good life to be, the amount of stuff we have, the amount of energy we consume. But actually, is that really a good life? As you hinted at, Joe, is having one of these bloody devices constantly pinging in our ears a good life? Is
No,
feeling that you
really
can only
shit.
be happy if you buy stuff and running out of money at the end of the month every month, is that a good life? Is feeling anxious about the notification that you got through or someone messaged you, that's not a good life. But that's a story that still needs to be told. We need to tell alternative stories. We need to weave an alternative moral fabric. I think, when we talk about what is the work of a revolutionary, I think that's partly it. I think it's partly building a world where the very things that we wake up for in the morning and value and look forward to are different than what capitalism tells us is important or we should value or we should look forward to. And also that's essential to solving the climate crisis, because fundamentally how much we consume, how we live our lives would have to drastically change in the West.
Yeah, 100%. Is the moment distinct? Of course it is. I mean, we shouldn't underplay that early 20th century moment. But because, you had people who lived through revolutions, saw a communist state emerge, and then saw revolutions fail in their own country and had to live through fascism, right? The image of Gramsci going to a jail, or Jewish communists being thrown into concentration camps after living through revolutions, right? That's Jesus. Do you know what I mean? Like that's a lot. But the moment is totally different. And I think part of the difference is that the promise of progress we grew up on was much thinner, and it's incredibly different, right? It wasn't the promise of early 20th social democracy or communism. It was a kind of it sucked. It was a promise that sucked. It was a promise of zero
It was
sum
meritocracy, right?
Europeanist liberalism, right? And it was rubbish. And so I think I think that kind of bakes in some of the tendencies that you've kind of outlined, Joe, right? That make imagine an alternative society in the climate crisis even more tricky, because the kind of image of progress that we were raised upon is just much thinner as well. So it creates deeper pessimisms, the kind of cruel optimisms that Laurent Belin quote that you kind of talked about. I think that operates in that territory. I wanted to say another thing is,
is she the cruel optimism person?
Yeah.
Yeah, the reason. So I've never read that book, but the only reason I'm obsessed with it is that the cover art is just amazing.
Yeah, it's really.
Like I've got it. It's like this dog and it's like a dog and this yellow background and a woman on the floor. It's pinned to my fridge.
Yeah.
It's pinned to my fridge. Anyway,
it's really good. I really recommend it. It's a tough read, I find, but it is good. I wanted to think a little bit about this question of the Green New Deal and that kind of stuff, because I think you're right to do that boosterism versus realism kind of comparison, and I wonder there if it's just like, whoever buys boosterism, really, right? And a kind of grand majoritarian project.
I think it's only the activists involved to make us feel better. I think the boosterism is just for us.
You can't run a majoritarian politics on boosterism. Like it doesn't work. I think realism is quite important there. So look, like I think the Green New Deal made sense in a particular moment, particularly in the US. I thought that, I agree with what you've said about how you've characterized them, but I thought the Green Industrial Revolution framing was like terrible, because it evinced that same boosterism, right? That and
yes, but I suppose I agree. But I suppose what I'm trying to separate is the idea that we need like big, massive, urgent state-led intervention from the comms that surrounded it. Like, even Andreas Malm has talked about the notion of like a war communist state to you know what I mean? And I think actually like GND people and him they use different language to describe it, but they're not completely
I think
dissimilar.
it might be helpful if you define what boosterism is, just so that people know.
Go on, Jonas. It's your fault.
Like an overinflation of possibilities and prospects, basically. That's what's meant for me. I think that's right. I guess I have a kind of skepticism here about some of this as well, right? Which is that like this kind of, let's call it lever ideology, right? Let's just pull a big stick and sort it out from above.
Yeah.
Because we do need a politics of catastrophe. Like I do think we need a politics of catastrophe, basically a politics that reckons that we do need something approaching the revolutionary process to foment the kind of unbelievable change we need, whilst also changing our, and this is important, right? Changing our conceptions of needs and habits and wants in the process. That's what successful revolutions do, right? Like they, you know, they change the people who are involved in them.
Exactly.
And I think that's a really important thing to say. But we also need to reckon with the fact that we can't force revolution, like you can't will it. And so, like, how do you lay the groundwork, the seeds for its emergence? And that creates problems because, with the Green New Deal stuff, like you saw how, the climate movements and the energies of the climate movements of the 2010s and the 2010s really, both in an electoralist sense, in Bernie Sanders' 2020 climate plan, and in the actual climate movements themselves in the US, let's say in this instance, were absorbed into Bidenism. Like have you guys read that New Left Review essay that came out, or interview with Thea Ria Frankos? Really good, really recommend it. I only read it this morning, otherwise I would have circulated it. But she talks about the kind of security sustainability nexus, right? So the kind of energies of those movements were absorbed into a kind of a fusion of security, geostrategic, and industrial policy goals on the one hand, particularly in relationship to the US's competition with China, and then a bunch of discourses on the other, right? And policies that claim that certain industries are green, sustainable, or ethical. We could get into the reason why, Biden's Inflation Reduction Act was a failure. I think there's probably something there that kind of touches on the eco-modernist stuff, which is that, like, and Ria Frankos talks about this, which is the Biden government did not understand the composition of the American working class. The fact that the American working class is overwhelmingly concentrated in healthcare, education, food, retail, as well as like low wage, like domestic and personal services, and that like the relationship between that and the people that it saw as the kind of bedrock of the Inflation Reduction Act and that project was not going to reproduce your project electorally or hegemonically, if you like, and that poses big questions.
Well, and also just the reliance on market mechanisms to
100%.
to try and achieve this. Like most of the Inflation Reduction Act was essentially subsidies
100%.
To private enterprise to build stuff, and lo and behold, private enterprise wasn't actually that interested in building stuff. Almost like they should have just got the state to do it.
Well, but that poses questions here as well, right? Is because that she argues that, like, part of the problem is the left got way too ahead of itself, and it imagined that there was this really, imagine the left in US, imagine it was in China, and that there was this real strong, meaty, powerful green capitalist sector that it could imagine it was both in alliance with and also fomenting the struggles of the future against. And actually, that sector is just much weaker than the left accounted for in that. So there's a kind of boosterism in that kind of instance there as well, right? A misreading of like who your allies are. I think, like, I've been thinking a lot about Lenin since you sent around the questions yesterday. That image of Lenin leaving the Finland station in 1917, having just arrived mid-revolution. He wrote State and Revolution the year before. The April Thesis is on its way. He constantly spoke in that moment in catastrophist terms. Millions of workers had died at the hands of other workers in the war. Famines, pandemics, genocides plagued the people. And he and other Bolsheviks spoke. And in hindsight, naively, perhaps, when you see how the system dealt with the revolutionary wave, but spoke in terms of the impending imperialist catastrophe, right?
Yeah.
And Andreas Malm, as you've already kind of mentioned in his book Corona, Climate and Communism, speaks of us today needing that war communism, like in post-revolutionary Russia, to confront climate change. And I do really get that impulse, but like, and Andreas Malm has tried to ask this question in later work, but like, it doesn't really get to the question of who will be the troops in that war communism. Like, who will be the troops in that war? And I think there's a fundamental job here of articulation, which is that communities, whether it's through pollution or flooding or wildfires, will be organized for abandonment and are being organized for abandonment in specific relation to the climate crisis. How do you conceptualize those communities as communities of resistance or also communities of resilience, right? And how do you raise the possibility of those examples? Like communities who have to resist floodings in Lancashire, for example. How do you raise the possibility of those communities having to learn the realities of self-governance? Because those are the communities, when the state abandons them, who knows best how to deal with adaptation in propitious circumstances. But obviously, there's that question, and I think that's a really important part of the puzzle here, right? Is that people will have to learn how to deal with these things themselves in the absence of the state intervening, right? And then, but the question for us is, how do you connect that to a kind of majoritarian hegemonic project to conquer the state? Because we still live outside of revolutionary times.
Yeah.
Let's not hope for too long, but it's just. And then you have this kind of separate question, which is who are going to be the bloody shock troops? Who are going to put their bodies on the line to you kind of referenced it, Joe, but Lale Khalili talks about infrastructures of death, right? Who are going to be the we've seen the XR, we've seen instances of this. And so the job of articulation is massive here. But there is a real clash between the institutional electoral struggle, the limitations of success realizable through the state when your side is less powerful in the wake of the defeats of neoliberalism, but then also the timeline of climate change. And that's the thing that is the, which you talked about, but that's the big strategic challenge. And, I take some kind of optimism from these challenges sometimes. Like the odds are so bloody stacked that, when you feel quite bleak about it, you are reminded that there are scores of people who are ready to move on stuff in a number of different ways to protect human and non-human life. Like the recollections of firefighters in Pasadena, for example, who have huge trauma because they see non-human life worlds just destroyed, devastated within days and weeks, but kind of carry on. But yeah, the task is just enormous.
Yeah, just to come back specifically on that, Jonas, I think you guys cite Eric Olin Wright all the time. I'm now going to start citing Eric Olin Wright, and I started reading his book, How to Be an Anti-Capitalist. It's like a popular book that he wrote just before his death, and it's really good. It's the kind of stuff that I would really recommend everybody reads, and every Green member should read it. And he basically just articulates all of these different strategies for either overcoming capitalism or dismantling capitalism, and defines between revolutionary strategies of trying to smash capitalism from the outside, or state-based democratic socialist strategies of trying to dismantle capitalism via the state, social democratic strategies of taming capitalism using the state, this notion of resisting capitalism from the bottom up, and then also these ideas of trying to escape capitalism, so that they're kind of like hippie projects of tuning and dropping out. And he tries to essentially merge some of these for the 21st century context, and says that we should try and erode capitalism through doing various of these, such as trying to dismantle it from the state level, but also trying to resist it from below. And I see the contradictions in doing that, but I can also very easily see how some of those tendencies could be contained within an organization like the Green Party. If we could transition it to an eco-socialist place, I could totally see a Green Party that was aiming to take control of the state, to do the Green New Deal, Green Wall communism, whatever we want to call it, but is also actively organizing and building up the capacities of, say, flood victims to both escape capitalism insofar as they're managing their own affairs because there's been a level of organized abandonment, but also resist as well. And I can see those things existing within the same organization. They don't need to necessarily. There's lots of talk these days about movement ecology and how you have different kinds of organizations within social movements that fulfill different functions and then collaborate and work together. But I'm a partyist at the end of the day, and I want to see a big, powerful, and expansive eco-socialist party. And I just can see it being possible to develop those competencies within an organization like that, which is why we must all build the Green Party.
Oh dear. Sounded like an SWP member there. Where's your Green Party newspaper?
I'll get there. Well, we start publishing. I genuinely think we need a Green Party newspaper. Not in the sense that I'm going to be stood outside, Seven Sisters Station selling it, but in the sense that
I think you need a Green Party newspaper, but you're not even going to sell it yourself. What's that about?
I think the party needs a journal. I think the party needs a journal for sure. That's a completely different topic, though.
What would you call it?
Oh, I don't fucking know. Don't know.
Ecology.
Yeah, probably.
But readings for this week, I haven't been reading anything new, but that conversation did make me think of a book that I have read in the past, which is Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. A incredible story, but also an incredible tome of theory and Marxist analysis that takes you through the stories, the characters, the conditions, the agents of revolution, the horrors and the tortures, the balance of power. It takes you through all of these tales of revolution in such a rich and complete and just elucidating way. And if you really want to understand, you know, all the different factors that go into making a revolution, you know, from the way the land is shaped to where resources are stored in a particular geographic area to where people are concentrated, who those people are concentrated in different areas. All of these things go into making a revolution. And the Black Jacobins is such an incredible example of a story of all those parts coming together. Joe, what have you been reading?
I mean, for once, shitloads, because I did a deep dive for this take. I mean, obviously, you know, like obviously all in a revolutionary theory to stop the climate crisis, climate collapse was, you know, what a lot of it was based on, or rather in response to. And I should actually say that I probably mischaracterized the book at the start slightly, in that they don't necessarily say that revolutionaries should be planning for the revolution per se, but that no one is seriously building capacity towards creating a revolution by 2030 is probably the more precise way of saying it, just in case they end up listening to this podcast and they feel like I've massively mischaracterized their work. I think maybe the other book that I found really interesting was that book by Eric Olin Wright on how to be an anti-capitalist, which is, yeah, like a really popular book that I think you can give to anyone that is curious about capitalism and anti-capitalism and strategies for overthrowing capitalism and why you would do it. I think maybe a final quick one that I drew on that I really enjoyed was I ended up reading the journal Salvage. It's a journal that was started by Richard Seymour and others, kind of on the premise that I think a lot of like left-wing and socialist politics was too optimistic and too boosterist, and you had to reckon with the fact that we're going through intense crisis. That's the climate crisis, but also a lot of other stuff. I'm not going to lie, I did not like this journal during the Corbyn years, probably because of my position in the bureaucracy in Corbynism, my tendency towards boosterism, and just the fact that maybe there was more optimism to go around at that time, because it did feel like we were on the verge of taking the state and maybe doing some stuff. I come back to it now and it feels prescient, apt.
Because the new red, baby. Big up Salvage.
Yeah, some appreciation for Salvage. I think it's from their 2019 launch issue, but there's a specific editorial that I drew on quite a lot. The last third of which was a really useful critique of eco-modernism. So I'll include that in the show notes.
Which is a book now, right? The Tragedy of the Worker. That's the one you're talking about.
Is it a book?
Yeah.
Great. I didn't read it. I didn't read it. I just read the essay.
Yeah.
And how about you, Jonas? What you've been reading? Really I should probably rephrase that to Jonas. What are the many things you've been reading? And what's a snippet of what you want to share with us?
My reading's pretty slow at the minute. I've been
He's only reading 8 books a week.
Yeah, only.
I'm about halfway through talking to Salvage, China Mayville's Embassy Town, which is great.
So good.
Oh, this is such a brilliant book.
Have you never read it before?
I'm only halfway through it.
Have you never read it before?
Huh?
Have you never read it before?
Nah, I've never read it before.
Oh,
no.
You are. I'm really jealous. Yeah. I would love to read that again for the first time.
But I'm only halfway through it, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I'm loving it. But then Harry Holmes, friend of the pod. Yeah,
this is his second shout out. He better be grateful. You listening, Harry?
Yeah,
too many.
You better be grateful. Subscribe, Harry. But he has got a great article on food in the first print issue of Prometheus, which is a kind of left journal magazine, which has emerged. And it's a brilliant article. Everyone should go get a copy, give it a read. It's about, it's very relevant to our conversation, and it's kind of talking about just how willfully our food systems were dismantled in the neoliberal counter-revolution. and what kind of politics we need to do to deal with that, basically. It's a really, really brilliant piece.
Wonderful. So that's us for this week, guys. As usual, rate the podcast on the platforms that you're listening on. Do share the podcast with your mates, with your pals, on social media, with strangers, whoever. It all helps. Oh, no, there is one more thing I need to say, which is that...
This always happens now.
Sorry, guys. Rewind. We have been longlisted for the British Podcast Awards. And there is also... associated with the British Podcast Awards, a People's Choice Award, which if you go onto our Instagram, you will see information on how to vote for us. That the People's Choice Awards is completely based on listeners voting. The more people that vote, better chances we are for being shortlisted or winning that award. So go to the British Podcast Awards. You just need an email address. Real listeners, real friends use multiple email addresses. And yeah, you can vote for Life of the Party. And who knows, maybe we'll get shortlisted for that award.
Woo.
Woo. But yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you in the next episode.
This is an Ampersounds production.